You're tuned into the podcast Sentimental Journey, where discussions happen on the music of the World War II era. My name is Hollis Zimmerman, and I will be exploring this important time in music history. Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of Sentimental Journey. Thank you so much for joining me. Today we are going to examine the big band sound of the World War II era. The 1940s is when Europe was in conflict and the United States government was preparing for a possible war. Military funding increased and the Selective Service Draft went into effect in September of 1940. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, the United States entered World War II. At that time, big band music was at the height of its popularity. As American servicemen began to leave for distant shores, the songs of the big band orchestras provided the soundtrack for World War II. More than often than not, purveyors of swing consisted of large orchestras, often 12 or more musicians, playing arrangements that blended jazz and the popular idiom in such a way that the results attracted both dance and listening audiences. With the onset of the 1940s, the bands first continued marching on. The big powerhouse aggressions fronted by Charlie Barnett, Count Basie, the Dorsey brothers, Tommy and Jimmy Dorsey, Duke Ellington, Benny Goodman, Harry James, Glenn Miller, and Artie Shaw led the way into the new decade, but closed behind the innumerable others with veteran leaders such as Bob Crosby, Xavier Cugat, Jan Garber, Shep Fields, Sammy Kaye, Kay Kaiser, Guy Lombardo, Jimmy Lunceford, Freddie Martin, and Charlie Spivak. From the sweetest to most hardest driving, keeping dancers and record buyers happy. The strike had a major impact on the American musical scene. At the time, union bands dominated popular music. After the strike, and partly as a result of it, the big bands began to decline, and vocalists began to dominate popular music. One unexpected result was the decline of the importance of popular music of the big bands of the 1930s and early 1940s. The strike was not only the cause of this decade, but it emphasized the shift from big bands with an accompanying vocalist to an emphasis on the vocalist with the exclusion of the band. In the 1930s and pre-strike 1940s, big bands dominated popular music. After the strike, vocalists dominated popular music. During the strike, vocalists could and did record without instruments. Instrumentalists could not record for the public at all. As historian Peter Soderbergh put it, until the war, most singers were props. After the war, they became the stars, and the role of the bands were gradually subordinated. The other major cause of the decline of the big bands is the World War II itself, and the resulting loss of big band members to the military, the curtailment of traveling by touring bands because of gasoline rationing, and a shortage of shellac used to make records. It should be pointed out that before the strike there were signs of the increasing popularity of singers that were beginning to reshape the big bands. Smaller groups like quintets and quartets took an important role in the music, but the larger groups to compete often had a band like Tommy Dorsey and the Clambake Seven, Bob Crosby and the Bobcats, and Cab Calloway and the Cab Drivers. The social and economic uncertainty increased the number of smaller groups that evolved and encouraged the exploration of new music formats occurring at the growth and expanse of traditional big band swing music. The booking for many big band swing orchestras who performed regularly at clubs, dance halls, and restaurants had to cut back on their hours of operation with the onset of World War II. The popularity of band vocalists had little effect on falling attendance. Despite the growing signs of the economic difficulties, there were many popular big bands, including Glenn Miller and his orchestra, Les Brown and his orchestra, and Woody Herman and his orchestra, still performing for audiences. One unexpected result of the strike was the decline in popularity of big bands of the 1930s and early 1940s. The strike was not only the cause of this decline, but it hastened the shift from big bands with an accompanying vocalist to an emphasis on the vocalist with the exclusion of the band. In the 1930s and pre-strike 1940s, big bands dominated popular music immediately following the strike. Vocalists began to dominate popular music. Before the strike began, there were signs of increasing popularity of singers that were beginning to reshape the big bands. When Frank Sinatra joined Tommy Dorsey's band in 1940, most selections started with a Tommy Dorsey solo. By the time Sinatra left in 1942, his songs with the band with his singing followed by any solos by Dorsey or others. Glenn Miller was one musician that made a tremendous impact in the World War II era and was one of the prominent figures in big band music. He was born in Clarinda, Iowa, and moved to Fort Morgan, Colorado, and attended the University of Colorado and dropped out to study with Joseph Schillinger in New York City. In the late 1920s through the mid-1930s, Miller played in various bands across the country, working with notable artists such as the Dorsey Brothers, Benny Goodman, some of the King's new type of music, big band jazz. Glenn Miller recorded under his own name in 1934 without much success. However, in 1937, Glenn Miller put his first band together. The band was well received, even playing at the Roosevelt Hotel in New Orleans in the summer of 1937. Internal difficulties led Miller to dissolve that group by the end of 1937, though he quickly came back with a new band in the summer of 1938. The new group Miller organized became known as the Glenn Miller Orchestra. A band sought to have a sound all of its own. It ought to have a personality, he once stated. His formula consisted of a clarinet playing the melody doubled by a tenor saxophone playing an octave lower than other saxes in their harmonic support. He wrote 70 top big band hits in 4 years between 1939 and 1942 with his unique sound, with acclaimed songs such as In the Mood, A String of Pearls, Little Brown Jug, and Moonlight Serenade. In 1939, Glenn Miller, after a lackluster career, boasted a big hit, Over the Rainbow. In 1939, Miller's success on the charts led CBS to offer him and his band a place on the network schedule. He quickly went on to other radio shows such as Sunset Serenade and I Sustain the Wings. On October 7, 1942, Glenn Miller left his musical success to serve his country. At the age of 38, Glenn Miller was too young to be drafted, but volunteered for the Navy. Consequently, he was told that they did not need his services, but in 1942 he enlisted into the U.S. Army Air Force, leaving behind civilian life, but he kept his music career going. Reporting for duty on October 7, 1942, Miller received his formal commission as captain. In November, he was transferred to the U.S. Army Air Corps and was assigned to Maxwell Field, Alabama. By 1943, Miller was named the Director of Bands Training for Army Air Force's Technical Training Command and moved to the USAAF Basic Training Station No. 2 in Atlantic City, New Jersey. As Director of Bands, Miller began to recruit musicians. Any civilian who wanted to play for him in the Army Air Forces simply had to write him a letter of intent and give him details on their skills. He was appointed as captain in the Army Specialist Corps and devoted himself to raising soldiers' morale by modernizing the Army band. He completed his basic training. Glenn Miller organized the Glenn Miller Army Air Force Band. His group kept a busy schedule, over 800 performances, and 300 of them were his personal appearances. 500 of those performances were broadcast, heard by millions of listeners. His performances provided morale and entertained the soldiers. He also sent messages to civilians back home. Glenn Miller formed a network of service orchestras during the war effort. On December 15, 1944, Glenn Miller was flying on a plane from the United Kingdom to a performance in Paris, France, to play for soldiers who liberated Paris. The plane that Glenn Miller was flying disappeared while flying over the English Channel. It was unclear to whether his plane crashed due to the stormy weather conditions or was taken down by bombers returning from a mission that may have struck his plane. It's still unknown about Glenn Miller, but his legacy and career made a huge impact on the World War II era. While these new band leaders tested the uncertain waters of wartime America, the military draft went on unabated, and its consequences deeply affected the music business. Conscription created the phenomenon of more and more women instrumentalists populating the ranks of previously all-male ensembles. Although they encountered considerable resistance and discrimination from critics, the public, and often the sidemen in the bands, who cracked the big time and achieved some success. To name a few women who played the top flight, but mostly male organizations, vibraphonist Marjorie Hyams and trumpeter Billy Rogers established their credentials with Woody Herman. Melva Liston played trombone with Gerald Wilson's band. Guitarist Mary Osborne played with several bands, including Buddy Rogers, Joe Venuti, and Stuff Smith. Frances Shirley took the trumpet honors with Charlie Barnett, and Lionel Hampton hired Elise Smith for his saxophone section. Countless other women labored in relative anonymity with lesser-known orchestras, but virtually all of them possessed AFM union cards and could hold more than their own with their own male counterparts, despite an endless barrage of snide remarks about their abilities. The International Sweethearts were the first integrated all-women's jazz band in the United States. The group was formed in 1937 to raise funds for the Piney Woods Country Life School, a rural Mississippi institution for poor or unorphaned minority girls. When the band toured, the members actually lived in their bus, but given the racial segregation in the region. In 1940, they severed their connection to the Piney Woods School and moved to Northern Virginia as a commercial act and took bookings. The lineup of the International Sweethearts of Rhythm has changed throughout the band's career. The band settled in Arlington, Virginia, where a wealthy Virginian supported them. Members came from different races, including Latina, Asian, Caucasian, Black, Indian, and Puerto Rican. They were involved in World War II when many of the male jazz artists and groups were touring and were serving overseas. There were many all-female instrumental big bands that toured across America. During World War II, African American soldiers wrote the band letters asking them to come to Europe to perform, also making them the first black women to tour with the USO. As performance skills increased, the Sweethearts of Rhythm increased. Eddie Durham, who arranged for Count Basie, came as the band's music director. Towards the end of World War II, the International Sweethearts of Rhythm performed for American troops in United Service Organization shows in Europe and recorded for RCA Victor. Ina Ray Hutton was a successful female band leader in World War II era in the 1930s and 1940s, known as the Blonde Bombshell of Rhythm. Born Odessa Cowan in Chicago in 1916, Ina Ray was the older half-sister of singer and actress Jane Hutton. With the help of Irving Mills, she changed her name in 1934 and formed an all-women orchestra known as the Melodiers, which for a time included Toronto pianist Ruth Lau. The Melodiers made a few recordings but were featured in several movie shorts. She began singing at the age of 8 and appeared in several Broadway productions and the Ziegfeld Follies. In 1934, with the help of Irving Mills, she organized an all-girl orchestra known as Ina Ray Hutton and her Melodiers and toured with and recorded for 5 years as well as some film shorts. The Melodiers appeared in short films and in the movie Big Broadcast of 1936. They recorded 6 songs sung by Hutton before disbanding in 1939. Toward the end of the 1930s, she broke up the all-female group and her orchestra. Her ensemble made several recordings for the OK and Elite labels during World War II and made most of the recording opportunities when it toured through different military bases during World War II and also sent transcriptions to American troops around the world. In 1939, Hutton formed an all-male orchestra, which also made a few recordings and was featured on many Coca-Cola Victory Parade broadcasts from Army camps, naval barracks, and military airfields. She and her band appeared in a film short called Ina Ray and Her Orchestra. The following year, she was in a 1944 movie role in Columbia Pictures musical titled Ever Since Venus. Shortly after dissolving the Melodiers, Hutton formed an all-male group that lasted until 1944, a curious decision since men qualified to play in a professional band were increasingly short supply given the pressures of World War II. With this new group, she called herself the Queen of the Name Bands. Hutton continued in the music business in the post-war era. During the 1950s, Hutton formed a female big band that played on television and starred in the Ina Ray Hutton Show from October 30th, 1950 to October 9th, 1951. The program was sponsored by Alt's Beer on KTLA. She retired from the music business in 1968. Her last recorded performance came in a 1974 movie called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? She died at the age of 67 on February 19, 1984 from complications due to diabetes. If nothing else, Hutton legitimized the idea of women performing professionally in orchestras. Their acceptance opened the doors for others, and the later 1930s, early 1940s witnessed a number of new all-girl bands attempting to make a go for it. By the end of World War II, over 400,000 U.S. citizens were lost. The end of the war also caused a lot of celebration for America, and as a matter of fact, celebration songs were recorded like the V-Day Stomp by the Four Clefs. The feeling of relief after the war was over, which meant the troops were returning from overseas and families were reunited once again. One classic song that reflected the feelings of families reuniting and returning home from war is It's Been a Long, Long Time by the Harry James Orchestra with Kitty Callan singing lead vocals, which became one of the biggest hits as World War II ended in 1945. Well, today we have explained how the big bands of the 1940s and the music impacted the war efforts. We look briefly at the careers of one of the biggest big band entertainers who made a tremendous impact on the World War II efforts, Glenn Miller. We also examined some of the female big band musicians and groups, including the International Sweethearts of Rhythm and band leader Ina Ray Hutton. You can find us on our social media at Sentimental Journey. And please be sure to subscribe to our podcast at Sentimental Journey. Stay tuned to episode 3 of our podcast, Sentimental Journey. Thank you so much for joining us.